Welcome, viewers, to our next installment in the Inside Interviews with the Shia Research Institute. Today we have Dr. Amina Inloes joining us. Dr. Inloes is the author of Women in Shi'ism, Ancient Stories, Modern Ideologies, and a co-translator of Spiritual Mysteries and Ethical Secrets, and a contributor to the Tafsir al-Mizan translation project. She completed her PhD at the University of Exeter on Shi'i hadith. She's a lecturer at the Islamic College in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Dr. Inloes, for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And thank you for, as well, of course, for your time and for supporting our podcast. Today, we're going to discuss your book on women in Shi'ism, which I find is a unique book, as you yourself mentioned. There is quite a lack of literature written on women in Shi'ism. There's many texts written on women in predominantly Sunni narratives, in Sunni tafsir, Sunni hadith. But in women in Shi'ism, your book is a rather fresh contribution to the subject. And I wanted to begin with some opening thoughts of my own, and perhaps see how what you would, how you would respond. This genre of women in Christianity, women in Judaism, women in Islam, women in Shi'ism, let us say. How do we write about these subjects, men in, let us say, well, I wouldn't say men in religion, let's say women in religion, because that was more of, this is more, I think it's always assumed almost men, but unfortunately, but this genre and this subject, right, the creation of this genre within religious studies as a religious studies subject, and particularly Islamic studies subject. Joseph Mossad, in his work, Islam in Liberalism, has a section called Women in Islam, or Women and Islam. And he attempts to kind of outline how this subject has certain imperialistic assumptions in the way it's broadcast, in the way it's described by certain authors who have, or certain institutes or certain forces that have certain intentions behind the way they want to describe this, especially this whole, push of this imperialistic white supremacist push for saving Muslim women. Right? And he discusses, he gives many examples of this. How do we grapple with this reality of what Mossad is putting forward? And on the other hand, talking about these issues, right? And I just wanted your thoughts as both, as an academic and someone who's written on this subject and is aware, of course, of the kind of antecedent issues that surround it.
Everyone has an agenda. And in fact, agendas are discussed rather copiously in one of the chapters of the book. I agree that's an excellent opening question. And I think it's really something that should be addressed before looking at any of the content of this sort of work. First of all, beyond any sort of political agendas or imperialist agendas, I would say that there is something inherently othering or objectifying about treating women as a subject of religion, as sort of a subset or, an exception. Like one might talk about, oak trees in the forest. It suggests the forest is something different from the oak trees. And I do think that should be kept in mind. And certainly that's something that happens both on the academic level, with the many books about women in Islam, whether or not they share the same sort of politicized agenda that you mentioned, but also on the ground, so to speak, grassroots Muslim speeches about the role of women in Islam, it is somehow othering. While at the same time, as you say, these are discussions that have been very important to people, especially in the 20th century. And so it is necessary to be able to give them some sort of voice and to frame them in a way that people will understand. That said, although it's safe to say that with respect to the Abrahamic faiths, the topic of women in Christianity or women in Islam emerged because of a perception of male dominance in these faiths, especially the intellectual and scholarly traditions and matters of religious authority, which I think is quite fair to say that that's why it happened. Nonetheless, I do think it is legitimate and even necessary to discuss topics such as masculinity in Islam. And in fact, although I don't spend a lot of time in the book ruminating on my method and methodology, a lot of the underlying structure came from a biblical scholar who was using this sort of approach to examine notions of masculinity in the Bible. And I honestly think that's deeply understudied. It's improved a bit in the past few years, but there's not a lot that's written about that. But that is, in fact, a very crucial subject to the world. And it's definitely something that deserves a lot of attention. So it is very much a valid subject. It's just not the subject of this book. In fact, I think the same approach could be used to explore this subject, probably by someone else. But nonetheless, I do think that's a key point. As for the politicization of women and Islam, which is very hard to get away from, I do mention that at one point. I do point out that, anytime, especially in the news media, when people are talking about, say, women in Iran, which I was listening to on the BBC today, there is most likely some sort of underlying political or cross-civilizational agenda, whether it's overt or subtle. I don't personally have political agendas, or I didn't have any particular political agendas when writing the book, although I do understand that many of the figures, especially the contemporary Shi'i scholars whom I cite, people like Shahid Motahari or Abdul Karim Surush are heavily associated with certain political viewpoints, and to discuss them outside of a political context is very difficult. And nonetheless, I do point out that I'm not trying to do that, and I do urge the reader to try to depoliticize the discussion. But we do live in the real world; it is a reality, and I think that there does have to be a balance between being honest and saying things that may be necessary for the furthering of the benefit of the human condition, whether that simply be knowledge and understanding, or the underlying issue of women's rights and social justice for women, and improvement of the condition of women and men, of course. Balancing that with the fact that some things will inevitably be taken out of context by someone with an agenda, or even misunderstood, and that's just how it works. I do think that within Muslim circles, there's sometimes a hesitation to put forward any sort of criticisms of the received tradition or certain ideas that are circulated, as Islam in the contemporary world, because of this fear that it's just going to open up Islam to attack. We live in a very defensive time with respect to Islam, especially the 19th, 20th century, but even today. But I think that shouldn't stop us from having serious discussions. So that's how I handle it. But definitely it is very pertinent and sensitive point, especially with a topic like this.
Yeah, and you mentioned, if I recall correctly, in the preface or the introduction, you mentioned the word, or the two words rather, identity politics, right? And identity politics, women in Islam, women in Shi'ism is certainly in the contemporary times wrapped up in identity politics on either side, right? Either on well, both sides are supposedly salvational as well, or attempting to save somebody, right? Sure. But meaning this kind of imperialistic salvational agenda, and then on the other hand, the kind of pan-Islamic or Islamist salvational agenda on the other side that, oh, you know, cover up, you'll be saved. I'm not being sarcastic or trying to, you know, demean that in any way. I'm just saying that they both are wrapped up in identity politics, and you do mention that in the introduction. I found that was helpful. And
about the pan-Islamism, I would point out there's a broader notion of salvation there. It's not just the individual female. You know, we don't want her to go to hell, but it is, you know, literally trying to save the Muslim ummah. And you know, it's fair to say that, you know, certain ideologies about the hijab, or, you know, some somewhat restrictive views towards women, you know, have been part of a sense of resisting cultural colonization by the West. So I would see that, you know, more as a sense of trying to save the whole, not just trying to save the females from the hellfire.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the end of the day, it's my, you know, business between me and Allah if I go to hell or not. Of course, I don't want to, but, you know, it's my responsibility as a human being. At least as a Muslim, I believe that God has given that responsibility equal to people.
Yeah.
But, you know, to save the group is a challenging issue.
Yeah. Good point. I really appreciate that. And then coming again to this dialectic that you kind of point out in the introductions. I think the introduction is important. Some of it's kind of setting the stage for what comes later on in the book about not wishing to superimpose contemporary notions of patriarchy while recognizing there are issues, but also recognizing that there are certain definitions of patriarchy in the contemporary period or in the modern liberal Western thought or way of thinking about these things that you can't superimpose necessarily onto Shi'i tradition. And I appreciate that kind of that caveat that you do mention. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about what you that a little bit? Yeah.
In fact, I would say the caution goes beyond those two terms, but they're an excellent place to start. In general, when discussing history, classical text, scripture, you know, whatever it happens to be that pertains to the past and things that we've inherited, it is very difficult for a lot of people, you know, even professional historians, oftentimes to discuss these things without projecting our current views and standards and cultures on them, you know, which is something that's been integrated into modern hermeneutics, but it's still there. And all the same, when dealing with issues that are, you know, current issues, you know, still current issues within the religious tradition, you know, such as, is Islam inherently patriarchal, or is Islam inherently egalitarian with respect to men and women? You know, because these things are being discussed in a contemporary context, but looking back to earlier textual sources, there is a lot of conflating going on between the modern or postmodern condition and what was happening before. Now, in a book like this, which is focusing primarily on narratives of ancient women, to look at some of these issues, the distance, you know, chronologically speaking, is even vaster. And so you not only have the challenge of trying to discuss, you know, some of these concepts in a meaningful way without projecting modern ideas onto the past and, you know, assuming people were thinking about them or talking about them or experiencing them in the same way, but in one of the chapters, just, you know, really as a sort of baseline, I outline some prominent ideas about women in Islam that were popularized in the 20th century, you know, specifically on a sort of ideological level, and which many Muslims will take as a sort of doctrine of women in Islam, without necessarily considering that these are ideas that are, you know, for example, associated with a monetary society or an industrialized society, you know, definitely an agricultural society. That they're not eternal for all of the human condition. So, you know, talking about money, for example, is not really relevant, as far as I know, when talking about subsistence farmers 10,000 years ago. I mean, yes, some people went out and earned an income and, you know, took home their whatever form of currency they took home, but not every society in the past even had money. So there are a lot of ways in which we project assumptions about the nature of the world, which relate to our circumstances. And obviously not everyone's in the same circumstance today. People's circumstances are going to vary. So I do put it out there that it's good to be cautious about that, while at the same time, it's a bit like the first question you asked. We have to speak in a way which is comprehensible to people and which is meaningful to people. And, at the end of the day, patriarchy and matriarchy they're anthropological terms. They're defined in different ways. There's different ways to understand them. There are also just many different ways of looking at the human experience. Definitely the humanities is a much messier subject than, say, mathematics. A lot of times there isn't one single answer to a question, especially when it comes to things in the past. So I did put that caution out there, while at the same time they are relevant terms and issues in our era. It's a bit like talking about Islam and democracy. Some people will try to back project democracy on the 7th century Arabia. I think that's a stretch, because democracy today is associated with certain social political institutions that are a sort of modern technology, if you will, technology of the state. So when we talk about democracy today, we get certain ideas in mind. It doesn't mean we can't make some conceptual similarities, things like shura or whatever. But it's also important to recognize that there are differences in our concepts and ideas today do relate to the world we live in that was very much shaped by some of the philosophical and social developments in thought in the past, say, 3 centuries or so-ish.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that rather comprehensive response. Let's get into the heart of the book now. So, you discuss several biblical figures in this book. Let's start with the figure of Eve, who occupies quite a prominent role in your book. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to include her, the figure of Eve in your book, and how it connects to Shi'i hadith, just kind of in a general outline, and then maybe we could see where that goes.
Sure. Maybe I should just discuss the general approach for people who haven't had the privilege of reading it yet. And it is, in fact, a little bit of a hard book to find. I think part of the challenge is it's difficult to find online because they've put a diacritic in the title, Shi'ism, with that diacritic character. So you have to search a little bit to access it. But in any case, the main sort of structure of the book is that it is exploring notions of women in Shi'ism through narrative analysis of hadith. And in particular, this is narrative analysis of hadith regarding women who lived before the time of Islam. I still haven't come up with a sort of easy way to say that, because sometimes people think Jahiliyyah. And I don't mean Jahiliyyah. I mean people like Eve, who are part of a sacred narrative, or as you say, biblical women. But I want to be cautious about that term, because the stories in hadith do differ from the biblical portrayals. And it's not necessarily intentionally plugging into, say, biblical exegesis and so forth, except for a few places where there's obvious parallels. But the idea is to analyze the subtext of these narrations, to glean from them. How are these women portrayed? How is the relationship between men and women portrayed? I mean, a very basic question is what we were just talking about. Do these narrations, in the way these stories are told about these women, do they portray men and women as equal? Do they portray men as being in charge of women? Do they portray us as being a little bit superior? So what's going on? And then I look at a few other things too. Are there any sort of flags of other regional traditions or cultures, religions, whatever that might suggest some sort of association of this narration with a particular group? Because keeping in mind, I'm not taking any stance on authenticity for the most part. I mean, I have viewpoints about the authenticity of many of these narrations, but they come from a variety of sources, and there is probably a range of. There's some that are probably authentic and probably not. By authentic, I mean true or correct, not the typical definition. So that's done with these ancient women in order to interrogate some contemporary ideas about women in Shi'ism, which are listed out in the beginning, and there's helpful tables and charts, with results of various either hadith or groups of hadith to summarize things for the reader, summarize my findings, and to provide answers to some of these questions. Now, some people might ask, as indeed you did, why would I do this? For example, the most prominent woman in Shi'ism is Hazrat Fatima. Why not just write about her? And there are a few reasons. First of all, it occurred to me that it might be possible to get a little bit more of a authentic or nuanced understanding of the portrayal of women through stories which are less polemically charged. That is to say, any discussion of Hazrat Fatima is going to fit into the overall Shi'i versus Sunni narrative, if you will, who was supposed to take the Khilafah. It's not to say it doesn't happen with these, but, there's a lot going on with her. Whereas these people are a little bit more neutral. So one would assume like if I'm just telling a story in general, I'm going to portray the characters in a certain way. And that will in part reflect my understandings of how the world works, how human nature works, and so forth. So it's something that's a bit different. Second, as you mentioned, it does tend to be understudied. There has been something similar done with women in the Sunni hadith by Barbara Stowasser. So in a sense, it's a somewhat similar work to hers. Of course, the contents are quite different, but the approach is similar. And I think in general, because Shi'ism has such a rich body of post-prophetic literature, and many of the important debates in Islam, and hence also in Shi'ism, occurred after the time of the Prophet, during the time of the 12 Imams. Sometimes I think there isn't as much attention given to the ancient history. I mean, of course, it's mentioned, and it's that the prophets are revered, but there's a lot going on, both before and after the prophetic era. So I thought it's nice to look at it for that reason. And there's also something else which I bring up in the beginning, and that is Hazrat Fatima is revered so much in Shi'ism. And I don't think I need to qualify 12 or Shi'ism there. She's revered in Shi'ism in general to such a degree that she's sometimes treated as an exception to normal women, ordinary women, a bit like the Virgin Mary in Catholicism. There's, no similarity between someone who has the angels come down and dictate books, and she can pray and have the city of Medina come up on its foundations, as well as some more mundane aspects which make her different, which are mentioned in the book, which relate to physiology and so forth, that, there is a bit of a gap. And as much as, the idea of how is Hazrat Fatima a role model is quite popular in Muslim lay circles, there is this distance, and even some scholars will treat her as an exception, that, if someone is maybe advancing the, of course, unfortunate view that females are intellectually deficient, that they might put her as an exception, because she is infallible and is understood to have some divine inspiration, or she's understood to be infallible, whereas other women are somehow different. So I felt that that's probably not going to serve the purpose here. I also didn't want to get into a lot of statements about women are this, women are that, women's intellect is like this or that, because those tend to be very prescriptive. And they're a different sort of genre, and there's an intentionality behind them, which again is different from what just naturally comes out when a narrative is being told. So those are the main reasons why I picked these. Beyond that, it just felt right. It seemed to work. I do understand the title might be a misnomer for some people because they may be expecting to hear about, say, women during the lifetime of the Imams or Hazrat Fatima. And it's not that these subjects don't come up, because they still do come up. And I would say that the way things come up is just very organic. Like you mentioned, the chapter on Eve is very big. That's because she's the one that there are more narrations about, or the most of everyone who's mentioned in the book. Some Bilqis, there's very few Shi'i narrations about her, so there's only so many things you can say. And that's apart from the fact that Eve, within the hadith corpus, but not in the Quran, is treated as archetypal. Adam and Eve are treated as the archetypal male and female. Maybe not by every narration, but it's present there, and their actions are seen to have ramifications for men and women of the future. So this is some of the rationale behind why that was done. I'm going to answer a question that you didn't ask, and I would say that one of the ways this ended up, and again, this is very organic. None of this was pre-planned. In fact, I would say even I got to the conclusions really after writing the whole thing. I didn't necessarily know what I was going to find until the end. One of the ways that this differs from the Sunni treatments quite naturally is the emphasis on esoteric theology in Shi'ism, similar, for example, to some of the writings of Muhammad Ali Amir Mu'azzi, which some of us are familiar with. A lot of these themes naturally come up in these stories, and that adds a very different dimension to some of these stories, which tend to be handled within the dominant Sunni hadith literature, the Sahih Sitta and so forth. I'm not going to bring in like all the Sufi literature and so forth, but they tend to be handled in a more mundane way, more about their worldly life. But the Shi'i narrations do have a heavy dose of otherworldly or transworldly considerations. But that also brings a sense of concurrency. And once you step out of the worldly sphere, you're stepping out of a historical chronology. So you can have people interacting across time. You can have Eve and the Prophet and Hazrat Fatima and Imam Mahdi and us and everyone else in a sort of eternal dialogue, which again, that does facilitate the relevancy of these sorts of narrations. And, of course, that does characterize also academic work in general. Philosophers and authors and so forth exist in a sort of timeless sphere of the intellect where they perpetually interact, even if they're deceased. But that can also happen through conceptions of sacred time as well. Yeah, so that's an overview. I believe you asked a question which has now slipped my mind.
Yeah, and I guess a question that I would maybe you could shed just a little bit more light before we talk about Eve in Shi'ism. Maybe you could share with us one or two traditions about how Eve is represented within Shi'i hadith. Just how would you, so would this be correct to say that a distinguishing factor between the presentation of pre-Islamic women, pre-Islamic in the sense women that came before the time of the Prophet, right? Women at the time of other prophets, in Sunni literature versus Shi'i literature is the inclusion of this kind of esoteric wilaya dimension, which fits into this kind of, as you said, this timeless narrative, right? Connecting Eve all the way to, or Adam and Eve all the way to the time of the Imams, which also, I guess, reminds us of this notion of the pre-existential reality of the Ahlul Bayt being implanted into the loins of Adam, right? And like him as being, or that family as being a carrier of the spiritual charisma of the family of the Prophet, which, correct me if I'm off here, would not be so pronounced, if at all, in Sunni depictions.
Yeah, I mean, in Sufism it comes up, but not necessarily in the
mainstream Sunni canonical tradition, or what is believed to be canonical. Yeah.
Yeah, and that also has another very important ramification. Because these women are, there's a belief that the prophetic light is passed from generation to generation. It tends to reside in the male, but when the woman is expecting, then it resides in the female. And for that reason, for example, Eve, because she is for a short time, but still for a time, a carrier of the prophetic light, she can't be evil because that would blemish the stain of the prophetic light or the prophetic lineage. There is an emphasis in Shi'i theology on the spiritual and theological purity of both the forefathers and the foremothers of the Prophet and the Imams, or the prophets and the Imams. So when you get to ideas like Eve as the one who tempted Adam to sin, and of course we don't have original sin in Islam, but these things that demonize Eve and make everything her fault, you can't have as much negativity towards Eve and still remain consistent with Shi'i theology. Now, I mean, there are ways that sometimes it still creeps into the texts, But basically, you can't be treating her theologically, as the source of misery for women or humanity or whatever, or really any of these other women, or attribute to them any major, well, the ones that are mothers of prophets, because not all of them are, but these major failings, because they have this key role, in the transmission of the prophetic light from the heavens to the earth. And there's one narration about Eve, where the angels are, I actually don't remember. They're either prostrating to her or just surrounding her because they're so astonished by this light that she's carrying. So this is essentially what ennobles both Adam and Eve in some of this narrative. Of course, there are other things that are considered to ennoble the human condition, but that is one of them. And that's also a distinguishing point from the Sunni Qasas al-Anbiya literature. Of course, obviously Sunni literature does not support original sin either, but there is a bit more latitude for criticism of Eve or blaming her. Now, this is not to say that Shi'is don't culturally do this, because culturally Shi'is, like anyone else, do all sorts of things, and especially somewhere like the Middle East, where so many traditions have intermingled for millennia. That there is a sort of religious soup that underpins how Islam has been received. And so individual people will have all sorts of ideas. But with respect to what actually happens in the text, there has to be a certain reverence for people who are considered to be direct forefathers and foremothers of the Prophet. And the prophets in general, but especially the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could discuss a passage from the book, page 122. If our author could, if you have the book with you, you could turn to page 122. Oh, great. There we are. I found this hadith quite interesting. Maybe you want to take our viewers through it and then your analysis. I found it quite not necessarily representative of the whole book, but I found it to be quite interesting. Some of the hadith and then your analysis of it, right? Both on what it tells us, what it doesn't tell us, and the issue of authenticity. So maybe we could read, or if you want, you could read it out for us, or just describe it for us, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, so just to contextualize this in the chapter, basically in all the chapters, I've ended up categorizing the narrations into two groups, the quote patriarchal and quote equitable ones, understanding that the generalization could be a projection, etc. But it does work. And I would say in some cases it tends to be about 50-50. So you've got more than one viewpoint being supported by the corpus, which does suggest that not everything being discussed is authentic, because you're not likely to be getting conflicting subtexts from, say, one human being like Imam Sadiq. Not likely to contradict himself on a regular basis in terms of his overall worldview. But in any case, that does happen. And then there are certain, broader themes that I've grouped things together. So, one theme is marriage. How did she marry Adam? How did they get married? Is there a sort of hierarchy or equity between them? And then also there are some explanations put forward for some Sharia rulings in some of these, which again get to the archetypal idea that basically what happened with Adam and Eve somehow affects people for eternity. Even though that is not something found in the Quran, there's nothing in the Quran that is presenting Adam and Eve as archetypal men and women. Now, you can argue that Adam is portrayed as an archetypal human, which I think is valid. But in terms of gender roles or what happened later, that is absent from the Quran. But it does happen in both the Sunni and Shi'i hadith. Okay, so this is the particular structure of this narration, which is on our screen presently, is someone who comes to the Prophet and asks certain types of questions in a sort of, it's a common framework or a mold for a certain genre of narration, which I get to a bit later. We'll discuss who it is later, but it's attributed to Yazid ibn Salam. He says, so tell me about Adam. Was he created from Eve, or was Eve created from Adam? So it's an interesting question in and of itself. It does let us know that these things weren't all taken for granted in the past. You know, sometimes there's an idea. I would say it's among some Muslims, but I would say it's probably just a human thing that people today, no, it's an idea of modernity. People today are just very different from all those pre-moderns, and we think of things they never would have thought of because their pre-modern brains just couldn't have grasped them. You know, like asking why is there difference between male and female inheritance? That does come up in this chapter. So, you know, these ideas occurred to people too. The Prophet says, no, nay. Eve was created from Adam, and had Adam been created from Eve, divorce would have been in the hands of women, and it would not have been in the hands of men. That's a red flag to me personally right there. Now, in any discussion of my views of the authenticity of this text, by the way, I'm, for the most part, not doing chain of narration. We will get to the narrator. But this looks to me like an example of someone back projecting a fiqh ruling onto the prophetic era when, you know, the fiqh ruling was codified sometime afterwards. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the idea that a man is the one who has the right to divorce is a deduction that was discussed and agreed upon as part of Islamic law, with, you know, some exceptions and so forth. But I don't think there's strong evidence that this was a teaching of the Prophet, which he went around speaking to the Sahaba about. Now, you may disagree, so totally fine, but that is a known means of hadith fabrication, the sometimes accidental ascription of jurisprudential rulings which are codified later onto the Prophet. And this is also an example of a live and pertinent issue. As anyone who's worked within the Shi'i community knows, you know, the sort of problems that arise for women in divorce proceedings are sometimes quite complex, and some of it is due to the idea that a woman can't or shouldn't be requesting a divorce. Even, you know, I mean, I don't want to get off topic, but, you know, sometimes I find some people outside the community don't take this seriously because they don't live with it. And this is obviously, you know, you could say it's not necessarily a problem with the law 100%. It could be a problem with the application of the law. But the point is, what I'm pointing out is these are issues that have ramifications on daily life today, and apparently they did in the past. But here we have we have the idea that Eve was created from Adam or Adam's rib, therefore leading to an inequity in later times. Now, the question of whether Eve was created from Adam's rib or from Adam is addressed earlier in the chapter. As some of our listeners may know, we have both stories within the Shi'i hadith corpus. Eve was created from Adam's rib, and Eve was not created from Adam's rib. So it is a bit messy, but it's not certain that this is what has happened. I would say the narration that is given the most weight is the one that says she was not. So that in of itself does cast some suspicion on this because it conflicts apparently irrevocably with a more established narration, unless you give some other explanation. Al-Majlisi tries to put these things together. You know, discussing the correctness of the transmission or origination of hadith is, you know, it is sometimes a probability thing, and I've pointed out a few things which, you know, do cast some suspicions on it. You know, first the conflict with the narration. You know, the idea that the creation of Adam and Eve is somehow affecting people for all time, which is not a Quranic concept, something which might come across as unjust and is maybe a back projection of a later ruling. He said, was she created from all of him or part of him? The Prophet said, nay, from part of him. And had she been created from all of him, qisas would have been permissible for women as it is for men. From his inside or outside or inside? From his inside. Had she been created from his outside, women would have been visible like men are visible. And so for that reason, women are covered, mustatirat. Okay, another time to pause and add some commentary here.
Fascinating. Yeah.
First of all, the idea that women are covered does not appear to have been predominant before the prophetic mission in the Hijaz. And it was not part of the early Muslim practice. You know, the hijab, for example, as a piece of clothing in and of itself, or whatever. because I'm not quite sure when like certain types of clothing began to be called hijab, but the head khimar is ordained in Medina. That there's the idea in the Quran that the wives of the Prophet should seclude themselves. But, the notion of women's sort of invisibility and seclusion is something that appears to have developed culturally slightly after the prophetic era. It is considered by some people, and I think they're probably correct, to have been due to the expansion of Islam into Mesopotamia and the influence of the ancient cultures there. And this, of course, is something that has been taken on board in Shi'ism greatly. It is considered oftentimes part of feminine spirituality to be invisible or covered or unseen. Like Hazrat Fatima is conceived of as being invisible or unseen. For example, when she's drawn, she's usually, completely covered, obscured, or actually, I don't know if we have any drawings with a face. I mean, that's a whole other issue. Should you be drawing pictures of sacred figures in Islam? But the idea is that is elevated to a spiritual level and as an ideal within the Shi'i tradition, while at the same time, sometimes discussing things entirely in a spiritual level negates the real world impacts of these sorts of things, like if women have to go out and have jobs, for example. But in any case, here the Prophet is presenting it as an axiom. Now, the phrase sitr al-mar'a, the covering of a woman, that became commonplace in Islamic discussion later. I am actually not sure if that authentically dates to the era of the Sahaba or not. Someone might be able to fill me in on that. I've never looked into it. It just occurred to me when I'm looking at that. But certainly the conceptualization seems to speak to a slightly later era. Because, during the time of the Prophet, the female Sahabis were quite active in the community too, that there wasn't really an idealization of being covered or non-visible. Okay, from his right side or left side? From his left side. Had she been created from his right side, women would have had the same share of inheritance as men. Quite frankly, that's arbitrary. This does not sound like a just God. I'm going to create Eve this way, and therefore women are going to have this. For that reason, women received 1 share and men received 2 shares, and the witnessing of 2 women is like the witnessing of 1 man, which is a question that comes up, today. And here we have evidence it came up in the past. Why are there are these differing rulings? From where was she created? From the clay which was left over from his left rib. You have spoken the truth, O Muhammad.
Interesting. Whenever you like, you can close your screen there. Okay. Whenever you like. There's a lot to discuss from this because I think maybe one question I have for you, I haven't looked into that particular hadith, but some of these traditions, as you point out, as per your view, are anachronistic, at least in the way they present certain issues, and may not be, just for the listeners, actual juristic dalils used by jurists. They're just traditions that are found. They may not make it into the legal corpus, right? Because that's also a distinction, right? Some of these traditions may be presented in more of an ethical or akhlaqi domain, as opposed to making it into a fiqh al-istidlali book, right? Like meeting the bar of jurisprudential hujjiyah, right?
It's not going to meet the bar. And secondarily, just in terms of chain of narration, and secondarily, it's probably not going to be discussed today, even if it doesn't meet the bar, because it just ruffles so many modern sensitivities and things Muslims are trying to say about Islam. I want to point out a couple things, if I can.
Of course, please.
Just add a couple points. One of the main issues to me, this is one of the cases where I did mention the narrator, is it seems that he's identified with a narrator who is considered to be someone who introduced a lot of Israeliyat or Jewish material, which was non-prophetic, into the Islamic tradition. And I would say, both the frame story of a Jew asking the Prophet questions and somehow being very interested in what the Prophet had to say, despite the fact this guy's not a Muslim, he's a Jew. But, nonetheless, that occurs a lot within the hadith corpus, especially some of the narrations which are more dubious in their sourcing, but it's a common trope. And if this is probably coming from someone who was known for essentially fabricating hadith through introducing Jewish, I don't know what the right, I don't want to be offensive and say legend, but, ideas that were prevalent in the Jewish community and conceptions. And many of these things are, whether it's Eve being created from Adam's rib and so on and so forth. That's a big red flag that, adds to all the red flags. And the other thing is, it also does fit into a sort of frame story of a certain type of Mesopotamian narrative, which would link to some of the ideas which appear to have been more codified in the era of Mesopotamian dominance, which also has had a tremendous impact on the development of Shi'ism. So those are a couple key points that I think need to be considered. And these are some of the things that incidentally will come up when you're doing a sort of narrative analysis and subtext analysis that are not going to come up if you're just trying to collate the plot of narratives, if you will, or the facts, or does this match Islamic law, or these are things, subtleties that you get when you take a different sort of approach, but can nonetheless start to shed light on probability of accurate transmission from the prophet, which, I think my view is clear. I think there's a low probability, but the narration nonetheless reflects the viewpoints of some people and common viewpoints and viewpoints that were probably codified later and have become somewhat dominant. So I just wanted to add those two bits there.
It's a apt point. Even if these narrations may not meet the bar of legal jurisprudence, they nevertheless are included in the corpus, and they contribute to shaping worldviews regarding women. That's a reality, right? Again, that's kind of the elephant in the room, right? Okay, it exists, but it still contributes to the way the way women may be perceived in some circles by people reading these kinds of traditions and kind of onboarding them as some kind of orthodoxy. And when you read it from a literary perspective and you kind of look at the tropes that are within it and the certain possibility or shall we say the reasonable possibility that it's affected or influenced by the Israeliyat is an important point. Yeah, I think it's a
the converse is also true. Not only does the existence of narrations like this within the corpus influence people, but one has to keep in mind there is a selection process, or there was a selection process undertaken by various compilers to produce certain collections of hadith that they personally deemed orthodox or correct or valuable or whatever it happened to be. And that isn't always given a lot of attention. Sort of the intentionality behind this. There's sometimes a sense that these are just, the role of the compiler isn't invisible. But, obviously Sheikh al-Kulaini is very different from al-Bukhari and the type of material he's including, and not only because it's from the 12 Imams. There's very different agendas there. Yeah, I'm just pointing out that there are reasons why this was placed in certain books, not in other books. And there's also, an impact on us today.
And I think that also connects this, the selection criteria issue also connects to something else that you've discussed as a kind of broader theme in this book, which is the notion of women as property, right? Which is discussed, women as chattel, right? It's just discussed in Talmud, in Jewish literature, in Christian literature. This is not new to Islam or to a discussion within Islamic studies, but it is a prevailing narrative or conception or whatever you want to, however we want to describe it, which also plays into these sorts of narratives as well, or the way these narratives are interpreted or understood. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm not sure to what degree this is new to Islam, and in particular the Abbasid era of the Arab Muslim world. But But one of the ideas that Keisha Ali has written extensively on is the eventual, basically because slavery, and in particular slave women who were purchased to be companions for men, became so prominent during the Abbasid era. Frequently you'd have men purchasing women from different areas, whatever, whether it's just because that's what they wanted to do, or I don't know, maybe they're insecure and didn't want to propose to a woman, or maybe they couldn't afford a dowry for another woman, or all sorts of reasons. But it became socially prominent in a way that it wasn't in the prophetic era. I mean, there were slave women who were basically purchased and companions of a man, but it wasn't the dominant social arrangement, and it wasn't a sort of normal and common thing. The way it became much more common during Abbasid times. And she observes that this does lead to a treatment of marriage for women as being very similar to slavery, even in some of the terminology used. And that is something that has been inherited in the fiqh paradigm, but both Sunni and Shi'i fiqh. And I think it's something that has been inherited as part of the religious culture in some circles. I'm not going to make a generalization for everywhere. I think it varies culturally and so forth. But there is such a thing as an inherited religious culture, just like there's other forms of culture. But this is one of the ideas that comes up in some of these narrations, but not all of them. So again, it's a sort of, it's one of the ways where there's a lot of diversity in what is actually being said in these texts. But it's something that is worth considering and interrogating today, because this sort of paradigm does it underlies some of what we have received with respect to how fiqh is handled. So, for example, the example that came up of divorce before, the idea that it's in the hands of men, is to some degree, according to some people, influenced by the idea that there is a similarity between enslaving a woman and marrying a woman, especially once you get into other restrictions on women in marriage that are discussed in discussions about Islamic law, whether Sunni or Shi'i. I don't think there's a big difference between Sunnism and Shi'ism in this regard. But I think the difference is that because a good bulk of the Shi'i hadith corpus comes from the Abbasid era, the later imams, for various reasons, not disrespect to the Prophet, but just there are practical reasons why there's more material from later. They're dealing with the commonplace ideas of their time. Their companions are discussing the issues of their time, and I think this is one of the ways that it does filter through and affect the discourse today.
Yeah. But again, I guess not to play maybe devil's advocate, but just but this would this necessarily, in your view, indicate that the tradition is mawdu' then? That for example, the hukam itself, that, let's say, divorce lies in the hands of a man, of the husband, and not the woman, understanding that this concept of women as chattel existed, and is not necessarily a part of what Shi'is would believe is the beliefs of the imams themselves, but maybe product of a broader kind of social milieu, like you said, in the Abbasid period. But to draw the direct link, let us say, between a cultural notion and a hukum, one as being the cause of the other, I mean, how far could we take certain, I mean, and this would apply to any of these other kind of sociological paradigms, right? That we say, okay, well, at this time there was this prevalent social way of seeing society, or way society was built, and then here's the hukum. So going from one to the other and back to the other, kind of drawing the connection between the two, where would you find is the limit of the historian here and the analyst?
I think you're going to get different views from different people, which largely relate to what they're bringing to the table. someone who's coming to the table with the view that Islamic law as it's received today is essentially the will of God and essentially unchanging and not culturally influenced, is going to be very resistant to the idea of cultural influence on the development of Islamic law. There are certainly people who are more open to the idea that various cultural ideas may have developed influenced Islamic law, especially, when we get to the body of narrations, the authenticity is always a question.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say as a practicing Muslim, I would consider things that are directly stated in the Quran to be absolute, unless there is some reason why they're not absolute. Because some people might say, you can't deliver the Sharia punishments in certain political circumstances and so forth. So I'm going to backtrack, because obviously there are people who do consider the Quran to be socially contextualized too. I would give a personally much higher weight to what is considered to be the word of God by many Muslims, while keeping in mind the possibility that I do not know the will of God. These theological issues of the nature of the Quran have been debated extensively in the past, not as much today. Maybe some of it was contextualized or meant for a time, but I would at any rate, consider that to be a stronger source. But we all know the majority of Islamic law does not come from the Quran, and so it is a complex subject. So I think I would just leave it there. There are a range of views. I did intentionally avoid questions of jurisprudence in the book. For a couple of reasons. One, I was trying to avoid stepping on people's toes, because you're always going to make someone mad with a subject like this. I'm not sure it really worked out, because there's plenty that could be quite inflammatory anyway, despite the fact I was supposed to be only talking about stories. But beyond that, they're not. Some of these are not easy questions to answer. I would say that although I am a practicing and reasonably Sharia compliant Muslim, I don't believe that everything we have inherited as Islamic law is the absolute will of God. I think there is a strong human component in the derivation and perception of it. And, probably some of it is the will of God. But this brings up so many complex questions with respect to how Muslims in the formative era of Islam made Islam. How did they decide what Islam is going to be? Even the entire legalistic focus. Some could argue that does seem to be due to the influence of Judaism. Why doesn't Christianity have a strong ritual law? Why don't the Native American traditions have a sort of juristic sort of law? But we, to my knowledge, but Islam does. Would the focus have been different if the Prophet came to Japan, for example? I think there's some much broader questions here, and there is a tendency to treat Islam as a historical phenomenon. So I'm not talking about the revelation, which I would consider to be sacrosanct, but the development of what came after, what became practices and norms and so forth. Obviously, there's a lot of people who developed that. So I think it's certainly fair to interrogate that. But in any case, what I'm speaking of here more is not so much the Islamic law side, but how these ideas still affect people's ways of thinking. Again, in some cultures more than others, especially in real life situations pertaining to women.
Thank you, Dr. Inloes. Yes, and I just want to, of course, clarify that your work is not a work of Islamic law. You're looking at treating it as literature. So I don't want, there shouldn't be any misconceptions that it's the work of Islamic jurisprudence or prescriptive or something like that. That's not.
I also wanted to add that sometimes discussions about women in Islam focus only on the jurisprudential questions.
Yeah.
Which, it is an important point. It's obviously quite relevant to the modern era, but there is more. So I was aiming to do more, to do something a little bit different.
Great. Now let's wrap up with a little bit of a discussion at the end of your book, where you bring up the discussion of Fatima Zahra and how, and the work of Sulaym ibn Qays, how misogyny almost becomes anti-Shi'i, right? This connection between misogyny and anti-Shi'ism, or and where Fatima Zahra kind of fits into this discourse. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that as our kind of final kind of...
Sure. In brief, and by the way, this section is quite similar to what was in my article on the famous "Women are deficient in intellect" quotation attributed to Imam Ali, except there are a few points that, bluntly put, I was asked to redact from the article. So there's a bit more, but it's essentially the same idea. Yeah, so Kitāb Sulaym is distinguished by being the earliest Shi'i hadith collection, and I, to my knowledge, it is the earliest book of hadith. I mean, you have some small collections from some of the Sahaba or attributed to them, but it's really the first substantial work. And, whether or not it actually dates, to him personally, it is clearly, from the content, it dates to an early era of Islam. And presumably before other regional customs, particular Mesopotamia, began to influence Islamic culture as a whole, and the ideals of the elite and so forth. And so when you are reading it, again, from a sort of subtext perspective, there are some strikingly different portrayals of women in the book. And basically, to sum it up, I would sum it up the way you summed it up, that misogyny is attributed to those who, within Shi'i sacred narrative, are considered to be enemies of the family of the Prophet. So those who oppose the caliphate of Imam Ali, or who are said to have attacked the house of Fatima. And, these narratives in Islam, a number of misogynistic statements or acts are attributed to them. So therefore, and yet this is a very highly Shi'i work. I mean, you can't really get more Shi'i than Kitāb Sulaym, especially because of the way it's, situated with respect to the political dispute over the caliphate. Sulaym in place is clearly pro Imam Ali in that regard, no doubt about that. But that somehow starts to get lost in some of the later writings. But because this is such an early work, I think it should be given precedence in terms of its ideals and portrayals, because it is closer to the prophetic era. And so one would assume it would have more prophetic flavor, for the lack of a better word. And there are various indicators in it that do relate more to the culture which is portrayed in the time of the Sahaba, rather than the later cultures and the issues surrounding them. So I think that adds an interesting counterpoint to some ideals in Shi'i religious culture, I'll put it that way, that seem to have been a product of a later time, which include the idea of the invisibility of women, the idealization of that, this sort of more exclusion of women from the public sphere, a more hierarchical view between men and women. So a lot of this rumination about women's monthly cycles. These things seem to have become more prominent in what became the culture of Shi'ism. So, I'm not going to make any blanket statements about narrations or what is authentic or inauthentic or what the teachings of the Imams, but there is a certain orthodox religious culture that developed and somehow became passed on, where I can read a book by Sheikh al-Mufid and see ideas that are somewhat similar to what is considered to be a conservative or orthodox Shi'i today, when it comes to women or other things. But these ideas, at least from this book, don't seem to trace all the way back to the prophetic era. So I think that lends credence to the idea that some things that are considered to be norms in worldview, that are celebrated in the way Shi'i narrative is told today, for example, may not necessarily be absolutes, and there are other ways to look at things. And of course, people tend to hold their ideals as sacred. So this, of course, is something, again, I don't want to step on toes, which I may be doing anyway, but you take something like portrayals of Imam Ali and Hazrat Fatima. Many Shi'a will treat them as an archetype of a man and an archetype of a woman. And there are many traits that are sort of I don't want to say they're superimposed onto them, but the way they are discussed is archetypally, usually. You know, Imam Ali might be an archetypal warrior or father or orator or intellector for that matter. Hazrat Fatima is, she is passive, she's quiet in the way we portray her in our stories. Not always, because there is a second genre that's come out in the 20th century. But typically she's the victim. She's silent. She's the mother. Even if you look at the imagery, pictures of Imam Ali tend to have the sun, unless it's his martyrdom picture. But he's golden. He's bright. That's a very masculine image. Artistic portrayals of Hazrat Fatima have cooler colors. They usually involve the moon or nighttime, which is, cross-culturally has tended to be a feminine archetype. This doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one correspondence with who they actually were as living human beings on a sort of historical level. There's a blending of things that have been received historical and what they probably did as embodied human beings. So I'm not going to get into the issue of spiritual presence and survival after death, and because that's a whole other issue. But in terms of a historical reality, that's somewhat different from being a surviving archetype. But I would say the vast majority of Shi'a, and maybe this happens similarly in many faiths, can't really distinguish between the two. And in my view, due to the influence of Salafism in the contemporary era, and don't give me that look, I'm just kidding, you're not giving me a look, but the impetus of Salafism is shared by a lot of Shi'a, even though obviously Salafism is very anti-Shi'i. But this sort of very, if you will, I don't want to use loaded and charged words like fundamentalist or literalist, but this very black and white view of what is historical fact, and going back to it will save the Muslim world, is shared by some Shi'a, and that again results in a back protection. So if someone says something archetypal about Hazrat Fatima, which may have a spiritual truth, or as you pointed, ethical truths, or some value in that regard, there's an assumption that this is actually exactly who she was as a living being, about whom there are scant historical records, to be honest. But, nonetheless, as someone who was on the earth, there's an inability to somehow distinguish between ideals and historical facts. And this happens all across the board, not only with gender issues. But I think that's, something that sort of tends to happen as well, as it's all part of forming what becomes a religious culture, independent of things, not independent of, but apart from things that are very specific, such as certain strictures of Islamic law, or what is considered to be the accurate body of narrations.
Well, thank you for that response. I think we'll wrap it up there. I just wanted to thank you again for coming on our podcast today, and for participating. For our viewers and listeners, thank you for listening. If you want to know more about the Shia Research Institute, you can go to our website, www.shiaresearch.ca, and follow us on social media as well. Once again, thank you, Dr. Inloes, and we hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.